Dak had been dealing prior to last week's dud, so is he a start or a sit for you in Week 16?
He's a start, and I get it. Stinker last week. Put that in the past because he's got the Buccaneers. Did you know, Money, that every home quarterback who has faced the Buccaneers has finished 11th or better in fantasy points to the position, and only the Raiders have allowed more touchdowns through the air than Tampa Bay. I'm also starting Baker Mayfield. We've already talked about him in the show. I get it. 3 straight weeks. He's given you fewer than 14 fantasy points, but he's got the Bengals this week. They've allowed the second most points to quarterbacks, and he also had 4 touchdowns against them back in Week 12.
So before we get to the sits, let's get a beware.
Jared Goff, and this is a surprise to no one because if you look at his numbers, he's averaged 6.1 fantasy points since Week 13. His passer rating in those games, a combined 51.3. That's disgusting. And the Cardinals, they've allowed the fewest fantasy points per game to quarterbacks on their home field. So Goff is a risk for me.
All right, so let's get some holiday cheer. A little negative there with the beware and the sits. Let's start with the starts at the wide receiver position. And I can see the first name. You're about to share it with the people watching. You just said beware Goff, but we're starting with?
Robert Woods, because even though a quarterback may have a bad game, it doesn't mean his wide receivers necessarily will follow suit. In fact, Woods has still been good. This is a guy who's given you almost 30 combined fantasy points in the last 2 games, and he's running about 72% of his routes out of the slot since Week 12. Arizona's given up the 6th most fantasy points to slot receivers. I'm also starting Corey Davis. Now, I get it. He has been very inconsistent and unreliable, kind of like a roller coaster, but he will give you the gift of a fantasy championship against the Redskins. They've allowed the 4th most yards, 12 touchdowns to receivers split out wide, and quarterbacks who have targeted split out wide receivers against Washington, 102.7 passer rating. That's pretty good.
All right, to a sleeper.
Deshaun Hamilton. Hey, I know it's been Tim Patrick there in Denver, but Hamilton actually leads the Broncos in targets and catches over the last 2 weeks. He's playing most of his routes out of the slot, and the Raiders have allowed 8 touchdowns to slot receivers. So if you're in a deeper league or need a flex starter, Hamilton could be on the waiver wire in some leagues.
And then you're going to wrap it up with a couple sits.
I'm going to do that, and we'll stick with the New England theme. Sitting Tom Brady, I'm also sitting Josh Gordon. He's coming off a season-low 2.9 fantasy points. He's run the majority of his pass routes out of the slot at about 89%, and the Bills have allowed just 5 touchdowns to wide receivers who are split out wide, so this is a bad matchup for Flash. And Mike Williams, now I get it. Massive game last week. 3 touchdowns, a career game. But here's the problem. He's playing Baltimore this week. The Ravens have allowed just 5 touchdowns and the fewest fantasy points to wide receivers who are split out wide. Now, depending on the status of Keenan Allen, Williams' value could go up or down this week. But based on the numbers and based on the matchup, Williams is a fade for me.